Welcome to the research desk. The pre-electricity arc of history is complete. We've spent quite a bit of time examining how power was constructed and maintained before the modern era of instant communication.
We've covered a lot of ground. We saw how the Medici used accounting ledgers, specifically double-entry bookkeeping, not just as a math exercise, but as a mechanism of actual control across Europe.
And we looked at how the Dutch East India Company utilized meticulous voyage reports to, transform maritime risk into a global corporate empire. Plus, the Rothschilds weaponizing the physical speed of carrier pigeons for sovereign finance.
Right, and Paul Julius Reuter realizing that selling the communication infrastructure itself was fundamentally more valuable than trading on the news flowing through it. But today's subject did something entirely different.
Today, we're looking at an architecture of power that is significantly darker. It's fundamentally structural, and honestly, it's terrifyingly modern. The central question we must explore today is this: what if the most powerful oil company in American history was not actually an oil company?
That is the core of it, because I look at the historical data and the pattern that emerges is that John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil was an intelligence operation disguised as a refiner.
Well, I'm going to present the bull case here. Standard Oil was, at its very core, a genuine, unprecedented efficiency revolution. This was an entity that looked at a chaotic, dangerous, incredibly wasteful early petroleum market and disciplined it through sheer operational excellence.
Its true innovation wasn't just operational efficiency, though. It was the transformation of physical infrastructure into an omniscient surveillance layer. Rockefeller captured the transportation choke points of the 19th century, the rail lines and pipelines, to gain asymmetrical visibility into his competitors.
But you can't ignore the logistics. Rockefeller brought rigorous cost control, a massive refinery consolidation to an industry that was destroying capital. The ultimate result of this meticulously engineered machine was a world-altering benefit to the consumer, drastically lowering prices.
He converted physical telemetry into a weapon for absolute market domination. He didn't just build an efficient business. He built a closed system, designed to understand his competitors better than they understood themselves. He literally turned their own logistical data into the instrument of their destruction.
To really understand the sheer magnitude of the efficiency revolution Rockefeller introduced, we have to look closely at the absolute chaos that defined the birth of this industry. We are talking about 1859, Titusville, Pennsylvania.
That's when Edwin Drake finally proves that crude oil can be deliberately drilled from the earth, rather than just passively skimmed off ponds.
Exactly. And this single discovery triggers a boomtown economy that completely defies logic. We see farmers who were living in abject poverty just weeks prior, leasing their land at these astronomical speculative prices.
You had unstable, violent surges of crude oil coming out of the ground. It completely overwhelmed the local capacity to capture it. Men were literally drowning in mud and crude oil.
And this massive influx of raw material led to a dangerous overbuilding of refining capacity. Every single wildcatter and speculator assumed that consumer demand would rise infinitely to meet whatever supply they pulled from the dirt.
The supply chain was a disaster. You had railroads fighting brutal localized price wars, trying to salvage their economics through fragile pooling agreements that just inevitably collapsed.
Plus, oil was being transported in poorly constructed wooden barrels that leaked constantly. You'd lose a massive percentage of the product before it ever even reached a market. But the most critical failure of this early market was the product itself.
You mean kerosene?
Yes, kerosene, which was rapidly replacing whale oil and camphene for indoor lighting. But early kerosene was dangerously inconsistent. Because the refining process was haphazard, volatile elements, like naphtha, were often left in the mixture.
A poorly refined batch of kerosene could, and frequently did, explode in a consumer's living room lamp, literally burning their house to the ground. The physical danger was obvious.
The industry was fundamentally unsafe.
But the deeper vulnerability of the 1860s oil boom was systemic. The early oil business possessed a fatal blind spot. Absolutely nobody understood the system as an integrated whole.
Everyone was totally localized in their thinking.
Precisely. The independent refiners, the wildcatters drilling the wells, the railroad operators hauling the freight. They all suffered from profound structural myopia. A refiner in Pennsylvania understood his local output, his local labor costs, and his immediate buyers.
And a railroad executive in Ohio only understood his regional freight volumes and his immediate track maintenance costs. Nobody possessed the capacity to see the entire board.
Nobody knew the true standardized cost to refine a single gallon of kerosene across the entire industry. Nobody knew which specific railroad route could transport 1,000 barrels of oil to the eastern seaboard with the highest margin.
They didn't know which competitor in another state was drowning in debt, or which regional market was suddenly oversaturated and vulnerable to a price war.
They were operating completely in the dark, reacting only to the immediate constraints of their localized environment. The industry was blind.
That widespread blindness is precisely where John D. Rockefeller's background becomes the critical variable. Rockefeller was not a pioneer romanticizing the mud and the gushers of Titusville. He was a teenager in Cleveland who trained as an assistant bookkeeper and a cashier.
He was a man of ledgers.
He possessed this fundamental, almost pathological mistrust of vague assertions, speculative talk, and boomtown promises.
He only trusted what could be quantified, verified, and written in the accounts.
Which is why, when he entered the refining business in 1863 with Maurice Clark and Samuel Andrews, his objective wasn't to gamble on oil wells. He deliberately stayed away from the drilling fields.
He stayed in Cleveland, because Cleveland was the strategic nexus where the rail lines, the Great Lakes transport routes, the barrel suppliers, the banking capital, and the industrial labor force all converged.
He recognized immediately that refining was a process, not a gamble. And if it's a process, it can be mathematically optimized.
By 1870, after buying out Clark and bringing in Henry Flagler, he incorporated the Standard Oil Company of Ohio with $1 million in capital. And that name Standard was not just marketing. It was a calculated promise to the consumer.
It meant safety. It meant you could light your lamp in your home without the paralyzing fear of an explosion. Internally, that name represented his absolute obsession with standardization, standard costs, standard chemical processes, standard accounting metrics.
He was building an operating system for an industry that previously had none. But that narrative of operational heroism brilliantly masks the true function of that operating system. Let's look at what Rockefeller actually did with that initial capital.
He bought out the competition to consolidate a fragmented market.
By 1872, just 2 years after incorporating, Standard Oil had acquired nearly all the competing refining firms in Cleveland. They were suddenly processing roughly 29,000 barrels of crude every single day.
They owned their own cooper shops to manufacture barrels, their own storage tanks, warehouses, specialized byproduct plants. This was the pursuit of incredible scale.
It wasn't just scale. It was the deliberate, methodical construction of an intelligence network. Think about what happens when you buy a competitor's factory. You don't just get their physical kettles and their real estate.
You get their books.
You get their books. Every single refinery Rockefeller acquired in Cleveland functioned as a new data node. With every acquisition, Standard Oil absorbed the proprietary cost structures, the supplier relationships, the yield metrics, and the logistical realities of another competitor.
The independent refiners who were holding out thought they were just fighting a localized turf war against another, larger refiner.
They were entirely unaware that they were fighting a sophisticated, centralized information system. Rockefeller was systematically eliminating the industry's blind spot for himself while ensuring his remaining competitors remained trapped in the dark.
I see that pattern, but the logic behind focusing on refining rather than drilling is the absolute cornerstone of the business case for his operational brilliance. Why deliberately avoid the oil fields?
Because crude production was inherently volatile.
Exactly. A well could dry up tomorrow, or a massive new strike could flood the market and crash crude prices overnight. It was impossible to underwrite long-term capital investments in the drilling sector. Refining, however, was a predictable industrial process.
More importantly, refining was the specific node in the value chain where transportation leverage concentrated.
The structural economics of the railroads in the late 19th century were brutal. Railroads required massive, upfront capital to build, which meant they carried enormous debt loads. To service that debt, they required massive, predictable volume on their lines.
Running empty freight cars absolutely destroyed their capital returns. They desperately needed guaranteed traffic.
Standard Oil solved this existential crisis for the rail operators. Rockefeller and Flagler could walk into a railroad executive's office and guarantee a massive, consistent volume of freight every single day without fail.
In exchange for saving the railroads from wildly fluctuating traffic patterns, Standard Oil received volume discounts on their shipping rates.
Which is a basic, economically rational exchange of value. Standard provided the crucial baseload volume, and the railroads provided the discount. This allowed Standard to dramatically lower its cost of goods sold and efficiency passed on to the consumer.
That basic, economically rational exchange is a highly sanitized version of the history. The Standard volume discount was merely the entry point. It was the cover story. The reality of Standard Oil's transportation strategy centers on an arrangement conceived in 1871 known as the South Improvement Company.
The infamous South Improvement Scheme.
This was not a simple volume discount negotiated in a boardroom. This was a covert mechanism designed to fundamentally alter the competitive landscape. The railroads agreed to raise their published public freight rates for everyone in the industry.
And in return, the Allied refiners operating secretly within the South Improvement Company would receive significant rebates on their own shipments, dropping their effective rate far below the public price.
But the arrangement went further. It introduced a mechanism that defies modern commercial comprehension. It was called the drawback. Pause. Think about the sheer audacity of the drawback. Standard Oil didn't simply receive a discount on the oil it shipped.
Wait, walk me through the actual math on that. If I'm an independent refiner operating in Pennsylvania, and I pay the railroad $1 to ship my barrel of kerosene to New York, what exactly happens to my dollar?
If you pay the railroad $1, the railroad keeps roughly 75 cents. And they take the remaining 25 cents of your money and they hand it in cash to John D. Rockefeller.
Wow, so Standard Oil was effectively levying a private tax on its competitors' movements?
Your competitor is subsidizing your freight costs. You are generating revenue off of the operational expenditure of your direct rivals.
The South Improvement Scheme was undoubtedly controversial, and we must acknowledge the intense public reaction it provoked. When the details of this arrangement leaked, and secrets that large always leak, it triggered absolute outrage in the oil regions.
Independent oilmen rioted. They sabotaged rail lines.
They organized massive embargoes of crude shipments, refusing to sell a single drop of oil to Rockefeller. They exerted such immense political pressure that the state of Pennsylvania revoked the South Improvement Company's charter by April 1872. The scheme officially collapsed before it could be fully implemented.
It collapsed on paper, yes, but the psychological and informational damage was already done. The weapon had been revealed, and the terror it induced was permanent, which brings us to the event known as the Cleveland Massacre.
The buyouts in early 1872.
The mere threat of the South Improvement Arrangement shattered the independents' will to fight. It was the visceral realization that Rockefeller had the power to manipulate the fundamental infrastructure layer of the economy against them.
In a window of roughly 6 weeks, operating entirely under the shadow of this transportation monopoly, Rockefeller approached his rivals in Cleveland. He laid his books on the table to show them his costs, and he explained what would happen to their freight rates if they refused to sell.
In that 6-week period, he purchased 22 of his 26 Cleveland competitors. He walked away from that brief window, controlling 85% of the city's refining capacity.
They sold because he showed them the reality of the market.
The independents didn't sell because Standard Oil had a slightly more efficient chemical process. They sold because Standard Oil had weaponized the rail lines. They realized they were no longer competing in a free market. They were competing against the infrastructure itself.
I have to challenge the framing of the Cleveland Massacre as pure infrastructural coercion. We must look at the economic reality of that specific era, particularly the analysis provided by modern economists like Granit Lin Klein.
You're referring to their work on 19th century rail cartels.
Yes, the transportation market of the 1870s was structurally broken. The railroads were attempting to cartelize a market with incredibly high barriers to entry and massive fixed costs. but they could not legally enforce their own price-fixing agreements.
Railroad executives were constantly cheating on each other. Exactly.
They would agree to a fixed rate in a boardroom, and the next day they'd secretly lower rates to steal volume from a competing line. This led to destructive, unpredictable price wars that routinely drove rail companies into bankruptcy. Rockefeller didn't just exploit the railroads, he organized them.
He used his centralized refining volume as an enforcement mechanism.
By acting as the policeman of the railroad cartels, Standard Oil brought desperately needed stability to a wildly unstable, self-destructive market. If a railroad attempted to break the rate agreement, Rockefeller could immediately punish them by shifting his immense volume to a competing line.
Starving the cheating railroad of revenue.
This stability allowed for long-term capital investment in both rail and refining infrastructure that was previously impossible in a market characterized by constant boom and bust freight rates. Rockefeller was providing a structural service to the American economy.
The Grannis and Klein interpretation is economically sound if you assume the primary goal was market stability for the sake of efficiency. But once Standard Oil occupied that policing role at the transportation choke point, it gained something far more valuable than a stable freight rate.
What's more valuable than locking in your logistics costs?
A comprehensive sensor network. The railroads were no longer just logistics partners moving physical goods. They became informants. By sitting so close to the rail operators, Standard Oil could learn the entire industry through the movement of physical barrels.
You're saying the freight rates themselves were data points.
The negotiated freight rates revealed exactly which competitor was financially vulnerable. The daily shipment volumes revealed the intricate, proprietary customer relationships of every rival refiner. The route choices revealed the competitors' precise cost positions.
They could watch the tank car flows across the country and know exactly where product was going.
They could anticipate local market gluts or shortages long before the public market ever registered the price signal. They mapped the constraints of everybody else.
They knew when an independent refiner in Pittsburgh was overextended on credit simply by monitoring the frequency of his shipments to Philadelphia.
The policing of the cartel was just the mechanism to install the surveillance layer.
Let's examine the internal machinery of Standard Oil, though, because the cost advantage they built wasn't an illusion created by railroad rebates or surveillance. It was a physical, tangible reality driven by an almost fanatical obsession with efficiency.
We can look at this operating machine as functioning on a series of interlocking gears.
The first two gears were entirely focused on rigorous cost accounting and controlling the physical refining process. Rockefeller measured absolutely everything. This was a man who famously walked through a plant, noticed that 40 drops of solder were being used to seal a kerosene tin, and asked his engineers to try 38 drops.
And 38 drops leaked, but 39 drops held perfectly. Standardizing the entire company on 39 drops of solder saved a fortune.
He tracked the cost of crude down to the fraction of a cent. He tracked the exact cost of the white oak used for the barrels. He built his own cooperages and bought his own timber tracks. When they realized the green wood was shrinking and causing leaks, they built massive kilns to dry the wood perfectly before assembly.
He also poured capital into chemical research to improve the refining yield.
Early refining produced highly toxic, flammable byproducts like naphtha and thick, useless sludge. Other refiners dumped this waste into rivers, polluting the environment and losing money. Rockefeller hired chemists to find commercial uses for it.
They turned naphtha into fuel for their own plants. They turned the sludge into lubricants, waxes, and eventually petroleum jelly.
He turned massive waste disposal liabilities into entirely new revenue streams. And the data firmly supports the consumer benefit of this relentless optimization. Between 1870 and 1885, Standard Oil drove its own refining costs down from roughly 3 cents a gallon to less than half a cent per gallon.
A massive reduction.
Consequently, the retail price of refined kerosene plummeted from 26 cents a gallon down to 8 cents a gallon. This is a staggering deflationary benefit for the global working class. For the first time in human history, ordinary people could afford to illuminate their homes safely and cheaply.
Extending the working and reading day?
Even Ida Tarbell, Rockefeller's most famous critic, a woman who despised his methods, was forced to concede in her writing that Standard Oil possessed what she called legitimate greatness. Economic historians writing in the Cato Journal emphasized this exact point. Throughout the entire height of Standard Oil's market dominance, total industry output consistently rose and retail prices consistently fell.
The physical machine was a marvel of human industrial achievement. You can't wave away the 39 drops of solder by talking about railroad rebates. The cost advantage was intensely real. I don't dispute the reduction from 3 cents to half a cent.
It was built through rigorous discipline.
The danger lies in how that legitimate, painstakingly built cost advantage was deployed against the market. This brings us to the next gears of the machine. Standard Oil used its immense efficiency selectively.
You mean they targeted specific regions?
Because its baseline costs were mathematically lower than anyone else's. It possessed an offensive weapon that no independent refiner could match or survive. Standard Oil could intentionally drop the retail price of kerosene in one specific, highly contested local market,
Driving the price well below the cost of production for any local rival.
while simultaneously keeping prices artificially high in markets where it already held an undisputed monopoly. They used the massive profits from their captive markets to heavily subsidize localized, predatory price wars, systematically bleeding out competitors one city at a time. Pause.
This is exactly where the surveillance layer merges with the operational excellence.
The transportation telemetry told Rockefeller exactly where to drop the prices. The railroad informants provided the names of the independent refiners' customers, the exact volume they were buying, and the precise price they were paying.
Standard Oil's local agents would then approach those specific customers and offer them kerosene at a ruinous, subsidized discount.
They didn't have to guess where their competitors were vulnerable. The railroads handed them the map.
I would argue that Rockefeller's preferred method was not destruction, but integration. He often preferred to buy a competitor rather than destroy them through a prolonged, capital-intensive price war.
He recognized that a competing refinery owner possessed valuable physical assets.
And more importantly, human capital. They had local market knowledge, specialized engineering skills, and established distribution networks. If a rival was feeling the intense pressure of Standard's efficiency and logistical advantages, Rockefeller would invite them to New York or Cleveland. He'd prove to them that he could refine oil cheaper than they could ever hope to. And then he would offer them a choice: face a price war or exchange their independent operation for Standard Oil stock. This is a critical point that is often lost in the history.
He was offering them a share in the most efficient wealth creation engine of the 19th century.
Many of those independent refiners who took the stock became incredibly wealthy men. Once acquired, the newly absorbed refinery was evaluated ruthlessly. If the plant was outdated, it was immediately dismantled and sold for scrap.
And if it was well built?
It was integrated, upgraded to Standard's strict specifications, and tied into the network. This was rational consolidation, not mere conquest.
You call it rational integration. The historical record, particularly the testimony of the men who sat across from him, calls it coercive acquisition. Let's define the exact algorithm Rockefeller deployed across the country. It was a precise, conditional logic tree fueled by continuous espionage.
A ruthless algorithm.
If a rival was strong, well-managed, and possessed excellent facilities, Standard Oil would use its massive capital reserves to buy them out, neutralizing a competent threat. If a rival was weak, stubborn, or poorly capitalized, Standard Oil would apply localized, heavily subsidized price pressure until they capitulated.
And sold for pennies on the dollar.
And if an independent refiner attempted to escape this algorithmic trap by organizing with other independents, say attempting to build a new pipeline or a new rail route to the sea to bypass the Standard Oil choke point, the response was immediate and overwhelming.
Standard Oil would pressure the existing rail lines to cut rates.
Or they would buy up the physical right-of-way land blocking the proposed pipeline route, or aggressively acquire the key manufacturing firms required to produce the iron pipes for the new infrastructure project. The operational excellence merely made the threat credible.
It proved Standard could survive a price war.
But the intelligence made the threat inescapable. By 1879,
This algorithm had allowed Standard Oil to capture an astounding 90% of the American refining market. And by 1882, they formalized this control through the creation of the Standard Oil Trust.
The trust was a labyrinthine legal structure. It consisted of a 9-member board of trustees, governing dozens of seemingly disparate affiliated corporations.
This architecture was specifically designed to mask the reality of a single, unified monopoly operating behind the decentralized facade of countless local companies. The consumer in Boston thought they were buying from a local merchant. They were actually buying from 26 Broadway.
The legal architecture of the trust was certainly complex, but we have to understand why it was created. It was a highly rational, innovative response to the incredibly fragmented corporate laws of the late 19th century.
State charters were incredibly restrictive back then.
Extremely. Many state charters explicitly forbade a company incorporated in one state from legally owning property or stock in another state. Standard Oil of Ohio literally could not own a refinery in Pennsylvania. Rockefeller's lawyers had to invent a new legal mechanism to manage a national and soon global supply chain.
They created a trust where shareholders surrendered their shares to a central board in exchange for trust certificates,
allowing the board to coordinate strategy across state lines legally. It was an administrative solution to a legislative bottleneck. However, we must address how this era came to an end. The popular narrative often shifts to the idea that Standard Oil was this invincible, monolithic empire until the federal government heroically arrived with a sword to slay it.
The reality of the market dynamics is quite different. But the empire was nearly invincible for decades precisely because its greatest defense mechanism was total opacity. The trust operated entirely in the shadows.
It functioned through affiliated corporations, phantom companies, shell entities, and secret rebate arrangements,
which left outsiders entirely blind. Competitors, local politicians, and the American public could only argue from the effects of the trust. They saw the independent refiner in their town suddenly go bankrupt.
They saw the local retail price of kerosene drop precipitously, stay low until the competitor was dead, and then sharply rise again.
But they couldn't produce the documentary proof of the centralized structure that caused it. They couldn't prove intent. The turning point required a counterintelligence operation. It required Ida Tarbell.
Her serialized investigation in McClure's magazine in 1902 and 1903.
Tarbell wasn't just a journalist looking for a story. She was driven by a deep, personal understanding of the stakes. Her own father's business in the Pennsylvania oil regions had been devastated during the early oil wars by the South Improvement Scheme.
She spent years meticulously hunting down leaked railroad freight records.
She secured sworn testimony from bitter rivals. She interviewed former disgruntled Standard Oil executives. She did to Standard Oil exactly what Standard Oil had done to the independent refiners for 3 decades. She mapped the system.
She took the invisible, labyrinthine network of the trust and made it starkly legible to the public and to the state.
She published the intelligence.
Tarbell's journalism was undeniably a catalyst for public sentiment. It shifted the cultural view of Rockefeller from an industrial genius to a predatory monopolist. But public sentiment alone doesn't break up a corporation. That sentiment eventually triggered the formal, heavy mechanism of the state.
In 1906, the Department of Justice launched a massive, federally backed lawsuit against Standard Oil of New Jersey under the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890.
The government recognized that they couldn't win the case simply by arguing that Standard Oil was too large or too efficient. Size alone under the law was not necessarily illegal. They had to prove an unreasonable, deliberate restraint of trade. They had to prove the machinery of monopoly.
To prove that restraint of trade, the Department of Justice had to conduct a comprehensive intelligence audit of the Rockefeller machine. The court record of that lawsuit is absolutely staggering to read. The government exposed the entire architecture of espionage that we've been discussing.
They detailed the systematic, ongoing railroad preferences.
They exposed the absolute exclusionary control over the emerging pipeline networks.
They entered into evidence the restrictive contracts forced upon independent competitors.
They proved the localized predatory pricing strategies.
They even exposed the widespread use of bogus independent companies, companies that claimed to be local competitors but secretly reported back to Rockefeller's headquarters at 26 Broadway.
And they revealed the internal division of the United States into strict marketing territories that legally prevented Standard's own subsidiaries from competing with one another.
Through this lawsuit, the federal government finally possessed the subpoena power and the legal resources to build a countermap that rivaled Rockefeller's own telemetry. In 1911, the Supreme Court utilized this map to affirm the violation of the Sherman Act, ordering the dissolution of the New Jersey Holding Company into 34 separate legally independent entities. The state finally saw the board.
The Supreme Court dismantled the trust.
While the 1911 Supreme Court decision is lionized in history books as a massive triumph of antitrust law, we have to look closely at the empirical reality of the energy market at the exact moment the government delivered its blow. The government was, in reality, shooting a wounded giant.
The market had already shifted.
The market itself had already dynamically shifted. And those shifts had naturally broken Standard Oil's geographic and technological lock on the industry. By 1911, massive new oil discoveries had occurred far outside Rockefeller's control. The Spindletop strike in Texas in 1901 unleashed unimaginable volumes of crude.
Massive fields were discovered in Oklahoma and California as well.
Standard Oil's original power base, its pipeline infrastructure, and its transportation leverage were built entirely on the Appalachian crude of Pennsylvania and Ohio. They were remarkably slow to adapt to these new, distant fields in the Southwest and the West.
Furthermore, the technological landscape of the country was shifting rapidly. Thomas Edison and the advent of commercial electricity were beginning to illuminate the cities,
which directly threatened Standard's core kerosene lighting market. Simultaneously, the newly invented automobile was creating a sudden, massive demand for gasoline.
For decades, Standard Oil had treated gasoline as a highly volatile, dangerous byproduct of kerosene refining, often just dumping it in rivers or burning it off.
Because of these massive geographic and technological shifts, fierce new competitors had already emerged in the West and reached immense scale before the Supreme Court ever ruled. Companies like Gulf Oil, Texaco, and Royal Dutch Shell were aggressively taking market share by tapping the new fields and serving the new automotive market.
At the time of the breakup in 1911, Standard Oil's share of American refining had already fallen from its peak of 90% down to roughly 64%.
The monopoly was dissolving under the intense pressure of natural market forces, new supply, new technology, and new geography, long before the legal gavel ever fell. The breakup was essentially a lagging indicator of a market that was already fixing itself through innovation.
The fact that Standard Oil's market share had declined to 64% does not absolve the company of the systemic, exclusionary, and predatory practices it utilized to maintain absolute power for 4 decades.
A 64% market share is still dominant.
A 64% market share maintained through infrastructural coercion is a structural threat to free enterprise. The breakup was a necessary, punitive measure against the system built entirely on asymmetrical information.
But the importance of this history isn't just to debate the precise timing of Rockefeller's decline,
or whether the market or the state struck the final blow. The vital importance of this debate is to recognize the terrifying, enduring legacy of the model he perfected. When we look at the modern landscape of technology and commerce, the Standard Oil playbook is everywhere.
The core lesson Rockefeller taught the modern world is this: choke points create telemetry.
In the 19th century, the railroads and the physical pipelines were the choke points. Today, the choke points are digital. They are the massive cloud computing platforms that host the internet. They are the ubiquitous mobile app stores that dictate software distribution.
They are the dominant digital payment networks that process every transaction. They're the global ad exchanges and the sprawling e-commerce logistics layers that move physical goods today.
I think the operational reality of that analogy is profound.
Modern platforms, much like Standard Oil in the 1870s, are genuine efficiency revolutions. Amazon Web Services drastically lowers the cost of computing for a new startup. just as Rockefeller dramatically lowered the cost of refining and logistics for the kerosene market.
The Apple App Store provides a globally secure, standardized distribution mechanism for millions of software developers.
Just as Standard Oil provided reliable, non-explosive kerosene to the world, modern logistics platforms allow small merchants to achieve next-day delivery nationwide, something that was basically impossible a decade ago.
The legitimate greatness of these modern systems remains completely intact. They reduce friction, they standardize costs, they provide massive scale, and they create undeniable massive consumer surplus. We all benefit from the operational excellence of the platform.
They absolutely create efficiency, but just like Standard Oil, they also create an omniscient surveillance layer.
The modern parallel is exact. Just as the railroads gave Rockefeller privileged visibility into the independent refiners, today's infrastructure platforms possess privileged visibility into the flows, the health, and the metrics of every single business that depends on them.
Think about the mechanics. An e-commerce marketplace operator can observe exactly which third-party products are experiencing a sudden surge in demand.
They can map the precise conversion rates, the return rates, and the profit margins of a specific seller before the marketplace operator decides to launch its own lower-priced private label competitor.
An app store operator can see exactly which subscription applications are gaining traction, which specific features users engage with the most, and where independent developers are generating the most revenue.
Long before that data is visible to public investors or competing developers.
A cloud provider can monitor the scaling architecture and compute usage of a rapidly growing startup, perfectly understanding their technical constraints, their burn rate, and their market trajectory.
The infrastructure layer inherently knows more about the market than any single participant operating within it.
The political and economic instability arises when this platform efficiency is coupled with a structural conflict of interest. Platform power becomes dangerous when the entity that owns the choke point acts as both the referee and a player in the game.
It becomes a threat when they use their privileged systemic visibility to systematically disadvantage the very participants who have absolutely no choice but to depend on that infrastructure for their survival.
Standard Oil proved that the most valuable data in commerce is not customer data. The most valuable data is competitor data, extracted continuously and silently from the very pipes the competitor must use to breathe.
We'll have to agree to disagree on the ultimate historical and moral weight of John D. Rockefeller's empire. I maintain that his sheer operational discipline, his fanatic dedication to cost accounting, and his unmatched logistical genius built the modern energy industry out of chaos.
He disciplined a broken market.
He drove down the cost of energy and dramatically improved human living standards across the globe. The machine he built was necessary.
And I insist that Standard Oil's true product was never simply kerosene, it was asymmetric visibility. Rockefeller proved once and for all that whoever instruments the machine controls the industry.
Which leaves us with a critical, unresolved question for the modern era. When the digital infrastructure we rely on to run our businesses today acts as both our essential vendor and our direct competitor, at what point does their data advantage cease to be an operational efficiency and become an antitrust liability? This is the Research Desk officially signing off.